This is Father Vogel. We continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We are still in part 3, looking at the different virtues. And last chapter we looked specifically at some advice toward those in the married state. And again, this chapter we're also going to be looking at the married state again, specifically living out chastity within the married life. So, St. Francis begins by saying that a holy marriage was first established in the earthly paradise. So way back in Genesis with Adam and Eve. And he says there was no disorder of concupiscence, nor anything immodest till the fall. So it was rightly ordered. All of our inclinations, including that of having to do with sexuality. It was good and created good by God. So it can be lived in a very good way within marriage, though after the fall it also can be distorted. So in order to kind of explain its proper use, he draws a parallel using food. So the first point has to do with that both food and sexual pleasure are ordered to giving life. He says, for the nourishment and preservation of life is good and holy and recommended when you eat food in order to preserve your life, to have sustenance, and maintain your strength each day. He says in the same way, when it comes to sexual pleasure, it is again for life, for the generation of children, and the multiplication of persons in marriage are very good and holy. So this is one of the very good ends of marriage. Secondly, it's also for union, both food and sexual pleasure. Again, food, he says, oftentimes we use it for promoting fellowship and in social gatherings, and that is a very good use of it. Something very just and honest, he says. In the same way, that is also one of the ends of marriage, for the union of the spouses, the union of the husband and wife through that one flesh union, or the renewal of their wedding vows, as we'll often call it. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as the marital duty, because it is so important that it becomes part of the expectation when one enters into marriage. He also notes that there is a freedom. First, when it comes to eating, we must be free to be able to choose what it is we eat if we want it to truly be good for us, rather than being forced. The same thing when spouses engaged in the one flesh union. There has to be a freedom for each other. They can't force one another to do it, nor should they feel forced in a sense by we have to limit it even to those times when we're able to have children. He says that no, even if it's not even possible to have a child at that time, as long as you're open to life, even if it may not be possible at that moment, then you're free to renew your wedding vows. Next, he speaks of pleasure. So he says, first in speaking about eating, that to eat not because of the first two, not because of life or union, but only to satisfy our appetite, he says is something tolerable, but all the same not praiseworthy. He says it's not a virtue or to get pleasure from it, though also it's not wrong. I mean, it's not like God doesn't want us to, when we eat, not feel pleasurable. Pleasure is part there because it can sometimes lead us to those greater reasons for why we ought to eat, to preserve our life, for union with others. So he says the same thing is true when it comes to pleasure in the sexual appetite. He says the mere pleasure of the sensual appetite is not a sufficient reason to make an action praiseworthy. It is enough that it is permissible. So what he's saying there is that just because a certain action in the area of sexuality is pleasurable to and agreed upon by both partners doesn't necessarily mean that it is a moral act, that it is morally good. It may still be immoral. But at the same time, he says, just because a legitimate act between husband and wife is also pleasurable to them, in no way makes it immoral. Certainly, pleasure will be a part of that act for husband and wife. But, in speaking of that, the next area he speaks of is excess. Both when it comes to food and sex, people can very easily get into excess when they're engaging in those activities. He says, so not to eat from mere hunger, but in excess and from disorder, is something more or less blameworthy. Insofar as the excess is great or little, excess of eating does not only consist of too large a quantity, but also in the manner and in the way of eating. So here he's saying that there's obviously eating disorders, that we can eat in the wrong way. If we're not eating for those good purposes of life, for being able to union with one another, but rather we're eating for, maybe it's like a stress reliever or something like that, or kind of a disorder, an addiction kind of thing, then that's not going to be good for us. Depending upon how much we eat, greed, gluttony can play a part. Also says that the manner and the way that we eat. So if we eat in such a way as to, we don't have good manners. We eat like animals in a sense. It won't be good. So he also draws the same parallel with excess in the area of sexual appetite. So he says, it's dangerous on certain occasions to those who exercise it. Sometimes it makes them die by mortal sin, a kind of perverted excess of the use of sexual desires. And this is true for people, obviously it's a sin outside of marriage, but even for those within marriage, he says. So when the order established for the generation of children is violated and perverted. So anything that denies that the generation of the openness to having new life gets in the way, then that's going to be a perversion, a disorder of the sexual act. So, the things that we see today, like abortion, contraception, masturbation, those kinds of things are immoral because they cut out the possibility for life. He specifically refers to Genesis chapter 38, where there was a man named Onan, and he speaks of the sin of Onan, which was a contraceptive act that we find in the Bible that is referred to by God there in the Scriptures as something abominable in His sight. Of course, he also wants to point out that he's not talking about a natural infertility. Just because a couple may be infertile and unable to have a child doesn't mean that doesn't render their sexual act immoral in any way. They're very different from one another. Finally, he speaks of the kind of mental states, the fantasies that we can put within ourselves. So when it comes to eating, he says, those who before dinner keep their minds on what was being cooked and after dinner on what was being eaten, he quotes from Philippians, they kind of make a god of their belly. We're always thinking about the food that we just had, how wonderful it was, or our mind is constantly on the next meal and how what we're going to make or where we're going to go eat. He says that's an excess. It's not virtuous. In the same way, it comes in the area of sexuality. This is definitely an area in which many will get caught up in different fantasies. So he says, especially even of married couples, he says they are not to remain entangled in attachment to sexual pleasures which they have experienced according to their vocation. When they are over, they are to wash their hearts and affections for them. So even though there are the pleasure that the husband and wife will experience in renewing their wedding vows is a very legitimate one, he says you don't want to become, just like to anything, too attached to it, so that our minds are always going back to it, and obviously certain fantasies can lead into some of these other kinds of things, the looking for pornographic materials and such are never going to be good for anyone, especially within the vocation of marriage. So he concludes by saying, "Let all therefore use the world, each one according to one's state in life, but in such a way that they do not attach their love to it. They ought to be free and ready to serve God, as if they do not use it at all. It is a great evil of man," says St. Augustine, "to wish to enjoy things which he should only use, and to wish to use those things which he should only enjoy." So we are to enjoy spiritual things and use the earthly ones. When the use of bodily things is turned into enjoyment, a rational soul becomes brutal and irrational like an animal. So within marriage, the use of sexuality as an expression of love towards each other and a renewal of their wedding vows is something very good. We just must guard against any possible ways in which it may be used in distorted or to excess. God bless.